بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Hamza, can I do a quick sound check? Just checking if the sound's coming through for everybody, and then I'll begin, inshallah. Yep. Okay, khair. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, today's discourse is on some elements of the night journey. I don't want to kind of repeat all the same details as everybody else has, because there's enough kind of information on that already. And I'm sure last month, Rajab, people really discussed it in detail in terms of the sequence of events during the night journey. And so I don't really want to repeat those details. But I do want to look at some things that I feel are important, and just some interesting points, both what's important and some interesting points as well related to the night journey. Now, I'm going to begin and probably end with a couple of controversial discussions. And not to be controversial for the sake of controversy, but I just feel that they're important discussions to have, generally speaking. So the first is the time that, or a discussion related to the date itself, when it takes place, and kind of issues related to that. That's the first kind of controversy, you could say. And the second part of the controversy is you could argue that it's to do with worship or special types of worship in relation to that. And the third controversy could be towards the end, is about seeing God, and some of the verses and the indications. So we're going to talk about all of them. Although that's not the central kind of idea today, but I want to introduce this because I have a few things to say. Now, I saw this last month anyway, Rajab, based on the kind of calendar, Muslim calendar, Islamic calendar, that people normally refer to as, although it's nothing really to do with Islam, but calendar that was put together by the early Muslims. There were a lot of messages that went around, and about Rajab itself and about Isra wal Mi'raj. And I want to critique some of those kind of ideas and some common problems, I would say. Number one, I want to talk about when this event actually takes place. So the historians or scholars that were more interested in historical events, like dates and things like that, like Waqidi and even Ibn Jawzi and people like that, there is essentially no agreement as to when this event takes place. And there are three parts of the date. So you've got the year, the month, and the day itself. In terms of the day, was it a Saturday or a Friday? Or, I mean, you get these random reports, it was Yom Sabt, or it was this day or that day. But that's not even a discussion, so we can put that to one side. Definitely there's nobody really knows that. But the date and the month are a discussion in some of the books. So for instance, Al-Wafa, Ibn Jawzi mentions it, Al-Waqidi mentions it. Ibn Hajar actually talks about it as well, and Nawawi talks about it. It seems to be of interest to some of them. Although it's not important in any way or form. The date is not important at all, of meaning when it takes place. If it were important, then it would have been stated in hadith literature, its importance, etc. In contrast to Laylatul Qadr, for instance, which is quite important in that sense. But so I want to go through some of these ideas. And normally people assume that, or people are kind of convinced for some reason, that it takes place on the 27th of Rajab. I just want to kind of give my take on it. And some people won't agree with me, but it's fine. It's no problem. I don't believe there's any certain evidence or any strong even evidence that in fact, I don't believe that it took place definitely on the 27th of Rajab. I don't believe there any evidence for that at all. There are statements of some scholars, yes, but there's no actual evidence for it, especially primary evidences. However, let's look at the month first before we look at the date. Does this journey take place in Rajab? And so there's no real certainty of that. In fact, I would argue that one opinion doesn't outweigh the other. Nawawi was sure, for instance, and Nawawi is a great scholar of the Shafi'is, Abu Zakaria, that it takes place in Rabi'. He believes that it takes place in Rabi' al-Awwal. In fact, the earliest opinions on this issue suggest that it takes place in Ramadan, that it doesn't take place in Rajab at all. And many scholars actually are of the opinion that it takes place in Rabi'. The night journey takes place in Rabi' al-Awwal. And then other scholars later said, or other people had this opinion that it takes place in Rajab. So there's no certainty whatsoever in any way or form. There are opinions only of some people, and most of them sanadless, chainless opinions. Except one riwayah that's disputed, and it's that suggests that it takes place in Rajab. So in terms of the month, I don't believe anybody really knows what month it takes place in. And there's huge dispute, like I said. And in fact, some of the people who are convinced about the month, there are scholars before them that are just as convinced about another month. For instance, Nawawi is convinced that it takes place in Rabi'. And Ibn Hajar actually gives quite a bit of weight to that as well, the idea that it takes place in Rabi'. Whereas Ibn Jawzi, even after mentioning all this difference of opinion, he states at the end that I believe it takes place in Rajab on the 27th. So this is, but after giving at least 7 or 8 different opinions. Now, in terms of the date itself, I believe that the 27, the idea of 27, I don't personally accept that, because it seems too coincidental that, the opinion of Abdullah bin Abbas about Laylatul Qadr taking place on the 27th of Ramadan, that all of a sudden we have another 27 now, without any real basis. So it seems to be borrowed for me from the idea of Ibn Abbas talking about the Laylatul Qadr. I don't see any other evidence for it. And considering that they don't even know what month it really took place, it's incredibly unlikely that they would know what date it took place on. 27th would be incredibly unlikely, because there's really no evidence for it except some statements of scholars. And take it or leave it. It's up to people if they want to accept that or not. But there should be full disclosure on the fact that nobody really knows about or when it takes place. As for there is a discussion on how many months before the Hijrah it takes place. Now, of course, it does take place before the Hijrah, that we know. It takes place in Mecca. As for when it takes place, some say a year. In fact, I think Al-Dhahabi, although his opinion wasn't accepted, goes as far as to say that it takes place 18 months before, I think. But generally, it's anything between a year and 6 months before the Hijrah. Could it be 6 months, 8 months? There is a really interesting opinion, actually, that it takes place immediately after Ta'if, which would make sense as well, actually. Would make a lot of sense that it takes place after Ta'if. But it's not known for certain. There's that range, you see, 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, a year. You have that range amongst the scholars. And surprisingly, of course, whichever month you take, if you say 6, 8, 10, then their opinions will change on what month it was. One would render Rabi', another will render Ramadan, another will render Rajab. So it will be based on that. But overall, I mean, if we kind of want to bring this to a close or a conclusion, the date is not important, nor is the month important. And the fact that there's so much difference of opinion demonstrates that nobody actually knows when it takes place with any sense of certainty at all. How then has it become that this idea of Rajab number 1 and 27th? I think these things happen historically, where things are disseminated amongst the public and people just fix a date and they just stick to it, and it becomes famous, and then it becomes a religious event. And that's kind of the problem sometimes, of course. That brings me to my next point, which is I think is apt, is what about these what about the night itself? Therefore, like the position that I take, and I believe it's the strongest position on this idea that there is no fixed night. The scholars, like I said, they don't know when it takes place. So therefore, the whole idea of what do we do on Laylatul Mi'raj is not an issue anymore. It's not a discussion anymore, because if you eliminate the first problem, or you accept the first problem rather, that there's no evidence really to suggest one way or another, then there's no discussion on what to do on the night, considering there is no night in that sense. Now, of course, people do send stuff out on the night, and I saw certain things which I want to address now. So some of the scholars have noted that this particular event, the night journey, is amongst those events that has many or a large number of fabricated hadith related to it. And it's true, you'll find them in many books as scholars critique certain hadith. In fact, there's a whole riwayah that's known as a riwayah of Ibn Abbas, which Sheikh Muhammad Saeed Ramadan Bhuti and others refuted, and it's just kind of this story, very long. Most people don't know about it. That's a complete fabrication of the Mi'raj story or take on it. All these fabricated narrations. But when it comes to the ibadah idea, we have a number of narrations for Rajab. So I'll begin with Rajab and then I'll build it up, inshallah, and add the night journey into it. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the great hadith scholar, has a work critiquing and criticizing really a lot of the hadith that are in certain books related to the kind of the merit of Rajab, the month of Rajab and the month of Sha'ban. The month of Sha'ban is another issue altogether, but almost all the hadith related to Rajab are either fabricated or they're extremely weak. In fact, all of them. There may be one or two hadith that are generally talking about the idea of it being a sacred month. So first and foremost, what's on the kind of plus side? The plus side is that Rajab is generally accepted as one of the sacred months from the 4 sacred months. Now, if we accept it as one of the sacred months, it has its own merit in that regard. So that's like an acceptable idea. There's nothing wrong with that. So we would apply any general rule of a month being sacred to Rajab as well. And the scholars have always said, that Rajab is a sacred month and one should concentrate on the ibadah more in Rajab. And I think there definitely some validity there. And especially considering it's just before Sha'ban and Ramadan, these 2 months were seemingly liked by the Prophet ﷺ. So there is a discussion there, and there's no problem with that. As for any specific ibadah for related to the Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, then there's nothing in our tradition at all. In fact, things like Salat al-Raghaib, this particular prayer that was prayed on the night of Rajab, is a complete innovation. And the Hanafi scholars have been quite clear about that and documented that. For instance, the great scholar Ibn al-Ghanim al-Maqdisi has a short book on that, where he just says that this prayer was started in Baytul Maqdis, and then they were from 2 people to 5 people to 10 people, and then it just became common amongst the people. And he really slams the whole idea of congregating on that night and having a jama'ah prayer. He considers it, he calls it bid'ah qabiha, actually, like a grotesque innovation. So, and that's where people would meet up on the night and they would pray these kind of nawafil in congregation together. And he also alludes to this idea that there's no special merit or for kind of specifying a date, considering that there's even debate and discussion about the month. And Sheikh Muhammad al-Qahtani, for instance, talks about that as well. And two elements that he discusses. One is the fast, and this is quite common. I saw on a lot of people's WhatsApp statuses that they were kind of passing along, or they were quoting this fabrication, complete lie attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, that he who fasts on the 27th of Rajab, so many, I don't remember the actual narration, but because there's so many iterations of that fabrication, that lie, that he's given, a reward of 10,000 fasts or 1,000 fasts, a complete and utter lie that's attributed to the Prophet ﷺ. There's no such hadith. In fact, the ulama have stated there are no hadith at all that are valid or that are sound, or that all these narrations that state that there's a fast for the night of Mi'raj, they're all lies that were attributed to the Prophet ﷺ and they're made up. And there's no validity to them at all. So there is no fast for that day. If it coincides with a fast on a Thursday or a Monday, of course, there's a sunnah fast for those days. But other than that, there is no fast. If you want to argue a fast, then you can argue it on your own behalf, but don't attribute it to the Prophet ﷺ in any way or form, saying the Prophet said this, or this is recorded as a marfu hadith, or anything of that nature, because that's not true, and one shouldn't pass that on. So Hamza, you're ringing me, but I'm in the class at the moment, so I'm in the discourse. I don't know if you're on. So that's an important issue. As for, like I said before, spending the night praying. In fact, Ibn al-Ghanim mentions for something very interesting, that he says these types of ideas, unfortunately, they bring difficulty for people, where people now will think that they have to stay up all night praying nawafil. And he says they end up missing a fard prayer, the Fajr prayer in the morning. And this is a very valid point, that why are we burdening the public, normal people, with more worship when there's no established position for that worship, when they struggle with their normal 5 daily prayers? Now, that brings me on to the last issue, which is, what about the whole idea of talking about Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj in Rajab? That I don't see a problem with. I think the maslahah is okay there. That generally speaking, like I said, scholars have said that it may have taken place in that month. And if that generally encourages people just to talk about the story, teach people seerah, take the opportunity to generally teach people seerah, and because people are more in tune with the kind of story taking place in that month, I don't think there's a haraj there. There's ilm, passing knowledge on, etc. I don't see an issue with that. My issue was more about this idea of this much reward on the night if you do this, and all these kind of fabrications that were attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, which Ibn Hajar, like I said, he critiques all of them and doesn't consider any of them valid to use in any way or form. So that brings me to an end in terms of that discussion. For that. Now, what's left is the actual journey, which I want to talk about now. So I've got that controversy out of the way. I want to talk now about a few things. And I've listed them down as, number one, the idea of the unseen. And I think that's a central part, and something we can take actually from the story. That's very, very important. I'm not going to go through the story itself. You can read that in the books out there. An excellent book in English is The Prophet's Night Journey and Heavenly Ascent by Sayyid Muhammad bin Alwi al-Maliki. It's an excellent book, which I helped publish many times. We did 5 reprints of that book. So you can go and get that. You can Google it and find it on the internet. And I'd recommend it. The first thing I want to talk about is the idea of the unseen. And what does that mean about this story? This story in the Quran is mentioned twice, in Surah Bani Israel and also Surah Al-Najm. And it's part of our religion to believe in this story. Allah says, Subhanalladhi asra bi abdihi, that God took his servant by the night, or in the night rather. And so it's part of our faith and our belief that this story does happen and take place. And no Muslim would deny the story in any way or form. And I don't believe anybody historically has ever denied belief in this story. There has been disputes and discussions on whether it were in the physical sense, the Prophet ﷺ traveled physically, or if he traveled in spirit. And there's that discussion you'll find it in the books. And all the details about that. Many of the Sunni traditional scholars have accepted that it takes place when the Prophet ﷺ in his wakeful state, especially between between his house and Baytul Maqdis. And so, but that discussion, I don't really have time or want to delve into that. You can find that, I'm sure, in other people have given in the discourses or talks in the last month. What I want to look at is why this night journey, I believe, an important point of why it takes place. The night journey is full of the ghaib, it's full of the unseen. And at this moment in time, remember, depending on where you put the night journey, if it takes place after Ta'if, it makes a lot of sense as well, that the Prophet ﷺ has just been through this kind of ordeal of going to these people in Ta'if and they rejecting him, and also throwing stones at him and harming the Messenger of God ﷺ, which would have been a moment in his life that was not a happy moment for him, was not a moment of happiness at all. So when he leaves Ta'if and these people, of course, don't accept Islam, then the angel comes to him and you have this wonderful event that takes place in the dua, this kind of this invocation of the Prophet ﷺ. This could be an answer for that prayer, that then God takes him on this night journey and shows him all these kind of miraculous things. And so that's one thing. And also it could take place after Amul Huzn. Amul Huzn is the year of sorrow, where a lot of bad things, not bad things, but a lot of things related to sorrow took take place. Say the Khadija passes away, his beloved wife. His uncle, his beloved uncle, Abu Talib, passes away. And also the Muslims are boycotted, and it's a very difficult time for the Prophet ﷺ and his companion, incredibly difficult time. And it could be now that this wonderful night journey that God takes the Messenger of Allah والسلام, through this journey, and all the things take place as we know in the story. But there's another point that I want to mention, that we as human beings are attracted to the unseen. And not only are we attracted, we're almost in need of the unseen to consolidate our belief. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in the Quran, those who believe in the unseen. But how do we validate that unseen? You see, it's one thing to hear something and just accept it. But when we hear of an experience, a vision, or a lived experience rather, it adds to that. And what I mean by that is, one is the Prophet ﷺ telling us that I went on this, I saw Gabriel, I saw this, I saw that. All things happening in the life of the Prophet ﷺ is another thing altogether, that he goes through a journey. And that journey entirely takes place in the unseen realm. He sees things from beginning to end that no other person can see, in a wakeful state, or has ever seen. And when it comes to what he sees when he meets the prophets, for instance, or after that. So then he comes back, the Messenger of God, and then he reveals it all to us. And I believe that that element of the ghaib, that story itself, not only increases us in our beliefs, so to speak, without getting into the theological debate about that, but it kind of gives us some type of solace and kind of consolidates or gives us comfort about what will happen after death. That here we have the Prophet ﷺ, not only is he taken on this night journey, but he sees people who have passed away. He meets them, he talks to them. He sees so many different people that are good and bad, that have passed away, some that have not come to this world. And it kind of shows us that these dimensions actually exist in a more kind of visual way. And I believe that that adds to the story tremendously, adds to our belief tremendously, because it now gives us not only uh, the the statements of the Prophet ﷺ, but now the experience through that unseen realm. And I believe that that's something that's very important about the story. That the story, we need to read it so that we know that these things actually exist. Rather than just being told that this exists and that exists without giving us a narrative. When the Prophet ﷺ is walking through these places, these planes of existence, these dimensions, this world of the unseen, walking through it, talking to the people therein, this really adds to our kind of iman, you could say, and gives us that real kind of strength in belief of the existence of these places. And I believe that that was one of the reasons of why the Messenger of God goes through that journey, for us to kind of benefit from it in that way. And just to give you some examples of that, uh, take for instance, and I'll mention a few random things at the end. Take for instance when the Messenger of God meets Ibrahim alayhi salam. So in this particular part of the story, he meets Ibrahim alayhi salam, and Abraham is praying. The Prophet Abraham alayhi salam is playing with children, and he's told, yeah, it's fabricated. I've mentioned it already. I've mentioned all. Sorry, just to answer his interjection. I don't know your name. Sorry, you always come with Sufi Jedi. So I mentioned already that all of the hadith, bar none, that attributed to the Prophet ﷺ about the 27th of Rajab or any specific worship are all fabricated. There are no hadith that are acceptable about that. None at all. The people haven't checked their references properly. That's the issue with it. They just haven't checked their references properly. Quoting from a book is not evidence. This is a very important thing in our tradition. There are many things in books that are not acceptable. You see, so merely name dropping or cherry picking or quoting from a book is not acceptable. The job of scholars and the job of students of knowledge is to make tahqiq, to go and check those narrations, go verify things. Merely, something being in a book is just not sufficient in any way or form. So so I don't accept that at all in any way or form. It's not only, it's completely fabricated. It's unacceptable, actually. The narration doesn't even make any sense. That to fast one day that you fasted 100 years. You would, yeah. So even Ramadan doesn't have that value in a hadith. Does it? Have you ever heard of a hadith that whoever fasts Ramadan is fasted for 100 years, and Ramadan is obligatory on the believers? So yeah, people shouldn't spread these types of things in any way or form. And unfortunately, this is part of our. It's just kind of the downfall almost of our tradition now, that things are just passed on amongst people, and even groups and people are putting this stuff out. People that supposedly have knowledge are putting this stuff out, and it's completely false. Completely made up. So khair, anyway. What was my point that I was mentioning there? About saying that Ibrahim alayhi salam. So he's playing with these children, and when he's asked about the children, who they are, or what's mentioned in the narration, is that these are children of disbelievers who had passed away before the age of maturity. And I know there's a whole discussion amongst the theologians and about the 10 or 12 positions, but generally it's accepted that all children who pass away are innocent. And they were playing with Ibrahim alayhi salam, saying Ibrahim. And that just goes to show that people who pass away are with prophets. And there are many narrations like this in the night journey that are interesting. And it gives us kind of hope and solace and information, and increases our belief in that sense in these things. And these are wonderful parts of that journey that really make us happy. And this is from the ghaib, and this is my point, you see, that just to highlight the idea that these were real things that the Messenger of God saw, alayhi salatu wasalam. These are kind of ru'ya haqq, that it was a real kind of vision. What the Messenger of God saw was true. So we have many of those, and I'll mention those towards the end. Another point that I want to talk about is the affirmation of the Abrahamic legacy. That this journey that takes place, the Messenger of God alayhi meets all of these prophets, Sayyidina Musa, Sayyidina Idris, Harun, Yusuf, Sayyidina Isa, Zakaria, Yahya. And this is just to confirm kind of the Abrahamic legacy that Sayyidina Ibrahim brought from the other prophets, that all of these historic prophets now, that our belief in all of them, and that the message has never changed. That the message is the same message that was brought by Sayyidina Musa, and the same message that was brought to us by Sayyidina Nuh and all of these great prophets, now affirmed by the Messenger of God himself, meeting them and conversing with them, sharing, and also taking from them in the story of Sayyidina Musa alayhi salam, and definitely the story of Sayyidina Ibrahim, which is even more important actually in some regards. So we hear about that. So this is to kind of further emphasize the kind of tradition of all of the prophets and our acceptance as believers of all of God's prophets. And some details are added to that in those stories as well. Like, it's fantastic narration about, I saw Sayyidina Adam, the Prophet said, our father, and he was just as the day God created him. And of course, there's an interesting point about Sayyidina Adam as well, that infer that, he was black, for instance. This idea that, anthropologically now we have so much evidence that the first man was black. And that his name is Adam, which, this whole discussion on Adam means the color of soil, for instance. And, I had this discussion, and it's more detailed, the discussion of the first man being black. But as Muslims, we don't have any problem with it. But when you mention it to some people, especially when they have a hidden form of racism in them, they'll say, what do you mean he was black? Or what did you think he was? Is that a problem for you? And they're like, oh, not a problem, but what's your evidence for that? Well, if I said he were light-skinned, would you ask for the same evidence? So what's the problem with that? Unless you have a problem with the idea of color, which is not a problem. If all prophets were black, it wouldn't have been a problem. What's the issue with that? So Al-Bajuri states that the reason you can't say that the Prophet was black is because he was not black. The evidences are quite clear of what his skin color was, that it would be a lie to say that he was something that he was not. That's all. Nothing to do with the color itself in any way or form. In fact, it'd be completely wrong, grotesque to say that by saying he's black is somehow a defect of some sort. But anyway, we have the narration of Musa alayhi salam, for instance, about his hair, the hair on his body, that he was so hairy, that he had so much hair on his body, rather, that if he wore two shirts, that you could still tell he had a lot of hair. And he was very dark-skinned in the narration as well, golden complexion or dark-skinned in the narrations that I have mentioned that. So we have these kind of things from the ghaib that these narrations that we hear. The next point that I wanted to mention is the existence of other dimensions, because the Prophet ﷺ seems to, on the night journey, like I said, I can't discuss this in detail because we don't have the time, experience time in different ways at different points. So I'll give an example. He sees a woman who is young, and she is decked out with all these kind of embellishments of the dunya, necklaces and things. And then he sees her a bit later, and she's old. She's old and haggard. And he asks who she is, and Sayyidina Jibril says that when he asks the first, and she calls the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ doesn't reply. Sayyidina Jibril says, look, don't reply to her call. And anyway, we learn that she represents the dunya. And at the end, the Prophet ﷺ is told that however many years this woman has in her old age when he sees her, they correspond with the amount of years that the dunya has left. I mean, there's not much time left in the dunya. Somebody brought up once that, why is it a woman this personification. And I said, well, read the next narration, which is that a man calls the Prophet ﷺ, and he doesn't reply. And that man is the devil. It's not about male or female. That's the point here. That's just nothing to do with gender, because then one would argue, why is the devil being represented in the male form? It's got nothing to do with it. So it seems that he experiences time in a completely different way, or experiences it differently at different points. So there's these kind of multi-dimensions that the Prophet ﷺ experiences of existence that we're completely unfamiliar with. And he experiences many of them. And if you want to really tap into it, it'd be interesting to look at all the different kind of structures for that. But so he experiences these, and they actually exist. Of course, we believe they exist. How they exist, we don't know. And these multi-dimensions and how they exist, we don't actually know. But the Prophet ﷺ most certainly experienced them, these different planes of existence. That's the next point that I wanted to mention. Now, I've written another point down, is the God's relationship with the Prophet ﷺ. And this is a really important one, that one could argue that this whole journey is to do with love, actually. That after all this difficulty that the Messenger of God has experienced, what greater is there to be called by the Lord? Allah Jalla wa'ala, your Lord now sends for you, sends the angel Gabriel, the archangel, to take you to him for the divine communion, this great conversation that takes place, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with the salah and all that takes place. But what is it greater than that, as a sign of love, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after all these things take place, that now this great opening, this great Fath al-Mubin takes place, where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is in divine communion. And this is almost like a story of love, in a sense, where it's out the love of God that this whole thing takes place, this whole journey takes place. And the Prophet ﷺ experiences so many magnificent things. Okay. So that's another point that I wanted to mention. And what we can take from that, I believe, is that this is kind of like sunnatullah, that when man goes through when we go through difficulties in our lives, that we have to have patience, and that patience results in often something magnificent. That the love of God is only truly known after being patient with times of difficulty. And then we're given these moments, these fleeting moments. Of course, they're fleeting, but the hereafter, of course, is forever. خَيْرٌ وَأَبْقَى, Allah calls it in the Quran. وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْتِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَالتَّرْضَى, Allah will then give you and you'll be well pleased. وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى, and what comes after is greater than what came at the beginning. So all of these, it's almost after difficulty, we just have to wait, and then God gives to us through patience, and God gives these openings, great openings. And the night journey is a kind of an example of that. Of course, nobody can experience the night journey. This was given to the Messenger of God, alayhi salatu wasalam, and he would, only prophets can bear these types of experiences, of course, but we can get something maybe of happiness after our difficult period, our difficult times. Often we hear stories where family members pass away, and the same day within that family, somebody's life is brought into this world. One of the family members has a child, a baby, and we see that God replaces. You see, so this is a great lesson to learn from the night journey, that with all these difficulties that the Prophet ﷺ went through, yet then God gave him the night journey. And all the magnificent things that took place during that journey, and to have patience and wait for that opening from God. I think that's very important. It's part of our religion, and it's to have husnul dhan billah, to have a good opinion of God, that God will be merciful to us, and He will give us these openings after difficulty. So that's definitely an important one. The next point that I've noted down is to do with the visions, and I want to mention some of them now, inshallah. some things that the Prophet saw that I believe that. And the reason I called it, Beyond the Night, is that I want to go just beyond the normal narrative of the story, or the normal narrative, sorry, or narrating the story itself. I want to look at some things that we can probably really benefit from, like the point of this ease after difficulty. And that is some of the things that he saw. Many of the things that the Prophet saw actually were related to oppression. That's very interesting. We find that, and I'll give you a couple of them. Take two narrations that are very closely linked, or sorry, take place one after the other, it seems, in the story. And one of them, he sees, alayhi salatu wasalam, a table, and there's rancid meat on it, kind of something that no one would really eat, nobody would touch, but people are just consuming it and eating it. And he asks, what does this represent? Sayyidina Jibril states that these are people, or the group of people that would talk about other people, backbite them, but in the sense that they would destroy people's reputations, etc. Now they're here eating that rancid meat. But then he sees something really interesting immediately after, according to Ghaiti's narration of the story anyway, is that he sees a table, and people have good meat on that table, and then they have really bad meat, rancid meat. But they're not eating the roasted meat. They're not eating that. They're leaving the good stuff alone. And he asks what this represents, and Sayyidina Jibril says this represents adultery. These people are people in the dunya who are married, and they have something good at home. Yet they go out and they commit adultery. And this is what they are made to do on the Day of Judgment. When I thought about that, it was, the point there is that these two incidents are to do with dhulm, to do with oppression, how we're taking other people's rights away, either destroying somebody's reputation, or spreading rumors about people, or breaking hearts, you see, in the case of adultery, destroying families, family units, destroying the lives of children, etc. So he sees many other things that are very closely related to dhulm, or are just completely to do with dhulm. Take, for instance, the perfume that he smells, scent of that woman who had combed the hair of Pharaoh's daughter. Again, Pharaoh kills her husband and her children, again related to dhulm. We see other stories, or other things that he sees. For instance, the person who would take kind of promise, it was to do with, some say politicians it relates to, and people of siyasa, but who would promise people all these different things. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this for you, I'm going to do this. And people rely on that person now. And he doesn't do any of it. And again, taking the rights of people, or filling them with hope and not fulfilling that trust. So there are a lot of things that the Prophet sees related to people's rights. And therefore, what I took from that, from the night journey, that the night journey and what the Prophet sees is to do, a lot of what he sees on that night is to do with the reformation of character. That when he comes back and tells people about this, that these were common things that probably were taking place, that people now reform themselves and become better believers and better human beings, that the night journey represented almost a warning for many people to reform their character. So when he comes back, alayhi salatu wasalam, you'll see most of these narrations are negative in that sense. He sees people being punished, and it's to tell them, look, I have seen it now. I have seen the people on the Day of Judgment, what they go through. I have seen it, in truth. And he returns, alayhi salatu, and tells the people, I have seen how people are being punished. It's almost a warning for people, and I think we can take great benefit from that and think to ourselves that these are the main things you could say that people are punished for on the Day of Judgment, taking other people's rights away. Another point, of course, is the end, and I'll dedicate maybe 10 minutes to this, inshallah, is when the Messenger of God, and some misconceptions about this as well. I said I would finish on a little bit of controversy. When the Prophet ﷺ communicates with the Almighty. Two points I want to make central points. The first point is that a lot of these storytellers, people who narrate the story, have really little knowledge, any. I don't know if they've studied theology at all. Where they say, "Oh, the Prophet at this point he left time and space," and this is completely absurd. La makan wa la zaman. This is I don't know where they get this stuff from. The Prophet ﷺ, if you accept that the night journey is physical, like most of the scholars do, the fact that his body went from one place to another is the fact that he's constantly in space and time. The time can be relative, of course, but he never left time. He never left space for sure. So he doesn't. There's no such thing as la makan wa la zaman in that context. The Prophet ﷺ communicates from God from a place. That place is an honored place that seemingly, according to some, like Dardi in his commentary of Al-Ghaidi, and others mention that nobody else has been blessed with entering that space where he talks to the Almighty, converses with the Almighty. So this is something that but I've heard people say that really don't have any training in theology, or maybe they just, Allah knows best, maybe they just heard it from somebody and repeated it, and everybody makes mistakes. I don't really want to. But, one shouldn't say that. Let's put it that way. The next point is, of controversy is, did he see his Lord? And this is, I remember years ago, I was at my mom's house and, there was Skybox. And so that's when I get to flick through these Islamic channels. But I don't have a television. That doesn't mean I don't watch stuff. Don't get me wrong. This is not a call to piety. I just never really had a TV. So if I watch anything, it'll be on the kind of computer, and I have a projector set up as well. So I don't have those Sky channels. But anyway, I was watching, and this guy was just going. He was just on a mission almost, to say whoever rejects, it's a kind of from only Wahhabis, have the opinion that the Prophet never saw his Lord, and the Sunnis have always. What on earth is he talking about? I thought this issue related to did the Prophet see his Lord or not is really a huge issue, a huge issue of dispute amongst companions. Just full disclosure, by the way, I take the position that he didn't see Allah. Now, you can try to shoot me for that, but you just haven't read on the issue if you have. Say that Aisha is categoric that he did not see his Lord, and other companions like Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Now, Abdullah ibn Abbas has a conflicting view. And it seems that many of the scholars who take that he did see his Lord take from this riwayah of Abdullah ibn Abbas. It's not an issue of belief anyway. And that is that Abdullah ibn Abbas has two opinions, or you can try to kind of reconcile them if you wish, but one is that he saw his Lord, and the other is that he saw his Lord with his heart, not as you see something with your eyes. And so they've differed about that. Like I said, there's this opinion of Abdullah ibn Abbas that kind of infers that he saw his Lord, and the other that he didn't see him. Rather, he saw him with his heart. So, but many of the companions are quite clear, like say that Aisha and Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, that he didn't see his Lord. Say that Aisha, in fact, not only is she's quite not clear, but very harsh with the words that she uses of anybody who claims that he alayhi salatu wasallam saw his Lord. But anyway, it's a matter of difference, and the scholars have differed about it as well. The scholars have differed about it, and you'll find varying opinions about this. Got nothing to do with belief, and doesn't make you more of a believer if you believe he did see his Lord. Because, like I said, unless you have more, your belief is stronger than say the Aisha. I think you should just stay quiet about it. But the people should have full disclosure on this, that there is a huge difference about this issue. And in fact, many of the earlier scholars lean towards more to the idea, I believe anyway, especially in their tafasir, that he didn't see his Lord. Now, whatever you want to take on that, it's fine. It's a disputed issue, but don't kind of relegate the other position to one of borderline deviancy, or even if you don't say that, you're kind of inferring that, that only people who don't know really hold this position. Or if they don't know, they don't have the knowledge, they don't really understand the book and the sunnah. It's really disrespectful to all those companions and scholars who held that opinion. And why is it that the version that you accept seemingly is correct over all of these great scholars like Tabari and Qurtubi and others? Anyway, Al-Razi, of course, as well. So that's a matter of dispute. What we do know, of course, is that the Messenger of God conversed with the Almighty, is that not enough of greatness and of love that the Almighty converses with the Messenger of God like he has never communicated with anybody before him. Isn't that enough of a story of love? And that's enough for me. So I don't. So I did say I would finish on a controversial idea. So that's that point. Now within this story, this narration we have, and like I said in Sayyid Muhammad ibn Ali al-Maliki's book, the story that narration is in full, and Ghaiti mentions it completely as well. We have the verses then. What about these verses? Do these verses in Surah An-Najm relate to the Prophet having communicating with God? I don't believe they do, and I take the opinion that the verses like Qaba Qawsaini or Adana are not to do with God. They're to do with Gabriel, the archangel, and I believe that it's a stronger opinion amongst the early scholars, actually. And even Sayyid Muhammad bin Ali al-Maliki in his famous book وَهُوَ بِالْأُفُقِ الْأَعْلَى also states that this matter is disputed, especially because scholars find it difficult to then interpret these events. The words like Adana, how can we talk about God in relation to these verbs? Some have a good ta'wil for it, a good interpretation, but others just say, well, it's not God that's been discussed in this verse. Actually, it's the archangel Gabriel. Because if we look at the surah itself, وَعَلَّمَهُ شَدِيدُ الْقُوَّةِ like Tabari and all the early Mufassir state that this force, this might, Shadid al-Quwa, that taught the Prophet in this ayah is the Archangel Gabriel. That seems to be the majority opinion of the early Mufassirs. So therefore the narrative is quite clear. وَرَآهُ نَزْلَةً أُخْرَى إِنَّ سِدْرَةِ الْمُنْتَهَى. It's the Archangel Gabriel. So all of that, those verses, but some of the scholars, of course, didn't see it that way. They said, no, look, it says, أوحى إلى عبدي ما أوحى, that he revealed to his servant what he revealed. And so therefore, all these verses are related to God. Well, you can hold that position, it's fine. Scholars have held that position. But I believe that the context is more talking about the Archangel Gabriel than that, and early Mufassirs agree with that. And again, the point that I'm making here is something that's a scholarly difference. And often, great scholars and many, if not the majority, early Mufassirs interpreting it as the Archangel Gabriel, Sayyidina Jibril alayhi salam. What's wrong with that? Is that a problem for people? Nobody disagrees that other scholars have gone the other way. But we shouldn't disrespect, downplay, or reduce that position to one of, people who don't really know, and actually we lovers know better than that these verses are talking about, Allah communicating with the Prophet as better than all these great scholars and luminaries. But like I said, it's a matter of difference and dispute amongst the scholars, and you can take it as you will, and prefer whichever position, or take whichever position sits right with you, if you wish, considering it's a matter of difference, and it's not one that religion is based on in that sense, if you don't accept one or the other. So inshallah, I want to call it to an end there, and I'll take questions, but hopefully that was of some benefit, especially whatever you wanted to take from that, if it was the disputes or some of the important messages that I tried to derive from the story. So inshallah, I'll take questions here. I don't think Hamza's with me today, so for additional questions. So. No, he is. I'm just waiting to see if there are any questions, and then inshallah we'll bring that to a close. Will you be doing this for 15th of Sha'ban? Doing what exactly? Like a critique? Is that what people mean? No, I will not. But I may answer the question of 15th of Sha'ban next week. Yeah, I'll answer that question if you wish. Not today because I don't want to mix it up. I will answer that question. Inshallah, I will answer that next week. Yeah. And if I'll give my take. Like I said, look, take it or leave it. This is my opinion, so I'm not forcing on anybody. So. Yeah, inshallah, all those things. Some are asking for the amal for Sha'ban. While we know for sure that the Prophet ﷺ fasted more than other months, he fasted more in this month. There's a discussion of why that is. We can probably bring that up next week. I do have a video on Sha'ban, a short video that I did for Ghazali Institute. You probably check that out. I don't know if I can't remember, I did it last year, so I don't know what I talked about in that. I'm sure I mentioned this idea of fasting more. Didn't the Prophet ﷺ say anything directly about seeing Allah? No. If he did, then there wouldn't be a discussion, would there? There wouldn't be this great discussion and dispute if it were clear. Look, the thing is, in scholars, what they normally do is they hold an opinion, and what they'll do is they'll argue it in a way that they kind of sometimes they disrespect or reduce the counter argument or the counter position. That's okay if the other opinion is not, if it's just kind of a weak opinion or something of that nature. But when it sometimes outweighs your opinion in terms of the number of companions or scholars, etc., then you should give that credit as well. You should, disclose that to the public and say, look, this is my opinion, but we have, this opinion as well. And in fact, I may take a slightly different take. I have a different take on this. So, yeah. You ask the Prophet ﷺ several questions on the journey. Do you know where you prayed? He answers no. Yeah, what's the question? Sorry, in that. Faiza, I don't. If you could, don't know what the question is there. What would be the best way to interpret this without lack of adab to the Prophet ﷺ? It's knowledge. I don't know how that would be disrespectful. Well, are you trying to say that why would the Prophet ﷺ ask a question? Like, can you say the Prophet ﷺ didn't know? I don't. What's the mushkila there? I don't. The Prophet ﷺ was asking him because he didn't know. The Prophet ﷺ not knowing something is not disrespectful to the Prophet ﷺ. Why would that be disrespectful? Unless somebody doesn't understand, unless somebody's built a framework that doesn't allow that type of idea, but I don't see that as a problem. Why would it diminish the Prophet ﷺ's rank that he asks about something, the archangel about something he doesn't know? There's nothing wrong with that. I don't see why that. Yeah, I don't know. Can a pregnant woman fast out of choice? That's not a question of Sharia. You should ask an expert about that, I think. Maybe a doctor or something. It's not about her, it's about what's good for her. So she look after her health, whatever's good for her health and whatever she's advised on that. 15th of Sha'ban, night of Qadr. I'll mention that next week, inshallah. When I don't want to mix the issues up of them, because Sha'ban is a little different to the night of Mi'raj, and there's more of a valid dispute on that. So yeah, about the Prophet ﷺ's knowledge, of course we believe that the Prophet ﷺ has an immense amount of knowledge, and nobody would ever deny that. And the Messenger of God is the most knowledgeable of all prophets, and he's been given more knowledge than anybody has ever been given, alayhi salatu wasalam, and he was gifted with knowledge that nobody would ever be given. In fact, he said, I am the most knowledgeable regarding my Lord. So yeah, so I don't see him. This was really shukran. Yeah, so Hamza, sorry if you've thrown any to the mix here. Nothing else today, okay, khair. if there's any last final questions, we can log off, inshallah. So I hope everybody, I wanted just to remind everybody, I want to take a different take on it. I hope it wasn't too off the what people expected, but inshallah. My discourses are normally I try to make them a little bit different. So khair, yeah, go on, last one on the phone. Oh, I was just about to log off there. What's the concept behind tariqas that describe mi'raj for prayer? I don't know what that means. What's concept behind tariqas? They describe spiritual ascension in prayer. I'll have to see like what somebody needs to show me what they mean about that. So I don't know what they're talking about. So if they can, like, yeah. What is my opinion about Ala Hazrat? I think he was a great scholar of Islam, rahimahullah ta'ala. I don't know if you're trying to get me stuck or something, but yeah, I believe he was a great scholar, a lover of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Nothing more to say. Yeah, so khair. Okay, so I normally, to be honest, I don't like those types of questions overall, because then people start sending in all sorts. I remember once I was talking and once somebody asked one, then they start mentioning every this scholar, that scholar. I don't write, So who am I to, speak bad about the ulama, in that sense? I never ever try to speak anything negative. I may differ with some opinions of scholars or take another scholar's opinion over another one's, but dare I ever disrespect one of the scholars? Never. Inshallah, I hope I wouldn't do something like that. So, Salah is a mi'raj of the believer. Is that Salah is a mi'raj of the believer? Okay, I don't know what the question really is. I'll have to think about that. Yeah. Khair, inshallah. We'll stop there. I think we can bring it to a close here. I'll see everybody next week, inshallah, on Wednesday. Sorry for the cancellation last week, but we'll be back next week, definitely, for sure as well. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.